The film that follows was made in 1975, the year after the Amboseli Game Reserve in Kenya was declared a national park. While it celebrated the intriguing beauty of the park, the film went on to criticize the impact of tourism on the environment, then a very new concern. The problems seemed intractable at the time. David Weston, the scientist in the film, is still in the park 20 years later. He has seen it recover, but this was its lowest ebb.
Amboseli, the empty place, is the Maasai name for this burning expanse beneath Africa's highest mountain, Kilimanjaro. In reality, Amboseli is far from empty. For one thing, people live here. It lies in the heartland of the Maasai tribe. It's only 150 square miles, but it's rich in Africa's most exciting big game animals. It's also the haunt of another species, the world tourist. They come here in churning minibuses at the rate of over 100,000 per year. Amboseli is caught between three apparently irreconcilable forces: the Maasai, wild animals, and tourists. The question is, can this wild place, one of the finest in Africa, survive these pressures, or must it suffocate in the dusts of Kilimanjaro? Today, Kilimanjaro is capped by the snows made famous by Ernest Hemingway. 2 million years ago, it was in full eruption. Like so much of East Africa close to the Great Rift Valley, the land was ripped apart by volcanic forces. Kilimanjaro rose to over 20,000 feet, created from the molten matter beneath the Earth's crust. It threw out enormous clouds of dust and gases that often blacked out the sun. In time, the dust clouds settled to form the soil of plains and woodlands supporting huge herds of game. Much of the Amboseli Basin is the bed of an ancient lake, formed when the rising volcano cut off a river. The lake long ago dried up, leaving salty sediments 400 feet thick. The grasses which grow in this soil are not of the first quality, but they're nourishing enough if water goes with them. The distant snows of Kilimanjaro provide that. Amboseli is situated just inside Kenya on its southern border with Tanzania. The towering volcano which dominates the scene lies inside Tanzania. There's a lot of variety within the park. The dried-up lake bed contrasts strangely with its two perpetually lush swamps, the Simek and the Longenya. Because of its water and grazing, Amboseli is annually used by 2,000 Maasai, up to 15,000 head of their cattle, about 20,000 wild animals, including 500 elephants, and 100,000 tourists who throng there to see the big game. Kilimanjaro created and shaped Amboseli over 2 million years ago. The great mountain rises from the plain 25 miles to the south. Huge blocks of ice rim its summit. The surroundings of the crater itself are a desert of grey ash. Snow never lies for long on this part of the mountain. The fire below is damped down, but the hearth is still warm. The amount of snow around the summit depends entirely on recent rainfall. And there lies Amboseli, hidden in the mists to the north of the mountain. Rain falling either upon the peak or onto the forested slopes below provides distant Amboseli with its essential water. The rainfall, mist, and melting snow vanishes into layers of lava and volcanic ash and flows underground 25 miles to the national park. There, only one spring emerges, crystal clear, above ground. Many more well up unseen beneath the swamps to which they gave birth. This is the secret water supply which draws so much life, both animal and human, into the park. In front of the elephant family, strolling down for its daily drink and wallow, stretches the larger of the two swamps, the Simic. Together with the other swamp, Longinia, it keeps Amboseli alive throughout the long dry season. The only water the place receives, a pittance of around 13 inches a year, falls mainly in one short rainy period. Amboseli's wild animals visit the swamps in turn, day and night. Soon after dawn, there's often a mass movement when many species come together to quench their thirst. This is more than just a drinking place. The water produces vegetation throughout the 9 months of the dry season. In the pale light that follows dawn, wildebeest find both food and drink here. That's a wading bird, a black-winged stilt. Just after dawn, as the air begins to heat up, the swamps are covered in a thick mist. Elephants surge, trumpeting out of the gloom. A family party of zebras. For them, the dangers of another night are over. Further along, a rhino wallows, feeding on the lush vegetation provided by a newly flooded arm of the Simic. Black rhinos are browsers. Those prehensile lips fold back weed, unexpectedly presented by the water at browsing height. Another wading bird, a spur-winged plover. Right by the rhino's mouth, a jacana, or lily trotter, a blacksmith plover, and a squacco heron. Amboseli rhino have always been famous for the length of their horns. Not long ago, there were two famous longhorns called Gertie and Gladys. Both are now dead, but their genes have evidently been passed on. The days when people saw 30 rhinos in a morning are sadly past. Maasai spears and uncontrolled hunting outside the park have taken their toll. two of the surviving rhino meet in a typically thick-headed and inconclusive confrontation. There goes a hippo. The swamps hold about 100 of them. The main herds of buffalo will come down for their drink later. The first comers this morning are a few of the oldest bachelor bulls, evicted from the herds by their younger competitors. They can be dangerous, though perhaps not for a cattle egret. Oxpeckers do one of the old bulls a service by removing ticks and other parasites. For him, life at Amboseli is free from care. Amboseli's many problems are the constant concern of the pilot of this aircraft. He's David Weston, a scientist who grew up in Tanzania. For 8 years, his main concern has been to find ways to preserve this national park from overuse by humans and animals. Funded by the New York Zoological Society, Weston lives in the park and flies his aircraft over it almost daily. As he crosses the Simek swamp, one of Amboseli's problems arrives in force. The Maasai are bringing their cattle to drink. The Maasai have always relied on the water of the swamps and the grazing it produces, especially during the dry season when all the other grass has disappeared. It's not hard to imagine the effect 15,000 head of cattle have had on the grass within range of the water. The swamps give a false picture of Amboseli as a whole. They're always lush and green, whatever the season. Only a few hundred yards away, the picture is quite different. For much of the year, the dusts of Kilimanjaro hang like a pall over wild animals and Maasai cattle alike. The scene will change dramatically when the rains come for a few short weeks in October. Until then, the dusty, overgrazed landscape looks a hopeless proposition. But this cannot be the whole story. If it were, Amboseli wouldn't support so many wild animals. People constantly talk about the balance of nature, but nature is always in a state of change. Far from balancing, it seesaws from one situation to another. Even without man leaning on the scales, Amboseli is changing at this very moment. Its once splendid acacia woodlands are suffering a sad decline. They look thick enough from the top of one of Amboseli's few hills, but at ground level, the trees are depressingly thin and becoming thinner. Even 10 years ago, the area boasted magnificent stands of yellow-barked acacias, often called fever trees. Their disappearance presented another problem for David Weston and his team of scientists. From a scenic point of view alone, it's a sad loss, but for the animals that rely on the acacias for shelter and for food, it could spell disaster. The giraffe depend on the woodlands. If the decline continued, their numbers could suffer severely. The 2-inch thorns are as delicate as asparagus tips to a giraffe. That's a lesser kudu staring through a thicket of thorny acacia. Lesser kudu are browsers, and they too will lose their food supply if the woodlands continue to vanish. They were once common, but have almost disappeared now. Vervet monkeys do a good deal of their feeding in the trees. The vervet has a high regard for acacia thorns and shoots, sucking them in gourmet fashion with some leaves for dessert. Impala depend on the fever trees in another way. They're grazing antelope, and they find much of their food among the grasses that grow in the shade of the yellow barks. Then, of course, there are the elephants, mighty consumers of all green things, the classic wrecking gang of African woodlands. The more so since they became confined inside reserves and national parks. If the woodlands disappeared completely, the elephants might survive on other kinds of food, but many other woodland species would vanish. At present, Amboseli boasts one of the most varied ranges of animals in Africa. It's fascinating to see how they all manage to find enough to eat in such a small area. The reason for this great variety of animals is that the permanent water produces such a variety of vegetation. Buffalo crop the taller grasses. Oryx can make do with poor, dry country feed. Wildebeest like the short, sweet grasses of the open plains. Elephants fit in anywhere. Amboseli has 17 species of antelope. Because they all have different needs, none threatens the other's existence. It's an efficient system, seen nowhere to better advantage than in this one small place. These are impala. That's a bushbuck. There's the female. Bushbuck prefer twigs and shoots. Waterbuck seek waterside plants and don't seriously compete with the other antelope. They're never far from water, as their name implies. For the moment, the buck's mind is on sparring rather than feeding. The warthog prefers short grass and tender growing tips. It also specializes in digging for roots. A big boar displays the warts beneath the eyes that give the species its name. Among a belt of wild date palms, a rhino trots with her calf. Old hunters say that the black rhino's bad temper derives from the food it eats. Often it seems to exist on an exclusive diet of the spikiest thorns it can find. Here it can vary that diet, though there's no evidence that Amboseli rhinos are more sweet-tempered than those elsewhere. At this particular moment, it's eating Belleria, a plant that has largely replaced the vanished acacias as an important item of rhino diet. No one had previously filmed rhinos chewing at bark like this. It's highly unusual behavior. The prehensile lips tuck away bark from a dead fever tree, one of the thousands that have died as a result of Amboseli's mysterious blight. Out in the dry country, far away from the swamps, live these graceful long-necked antelope. They're Gerenuk. That swan-like neck has evolved for a very special purpose, to reach parts of the trees and bushes that other antelope can't browse. That's the buck. Gerenuk can extend their reach by standing upright on their back legs, but they're still no match for a giraffe. Despite their ability, neither Gerenuk nor giraffe are at the top of the food chain. That position belongs to the predators. There are 6 known prides of lions in Amboseli, about 50 all told. That sounds a lot, but there is a great deal of food concentrated in this very small area. The lions prey mainly on zebra, wildebeest and buffalo. Amboseli lions always look remarkably sleek and well fed. The females produce cubs with great regularity. There's one creature that lives off their hard work. The lions have not left their kill for more than a few minutes before the first vultures glide in. For the moment, the lions are too well fed to bother about chasing the vultures off. Playing with their mother is the only thing on the minds of these cubs. The yellow-barked acacia, the fever tree, thrives close to water. Even on the edge of the Simak swamp, fallen trees lie like victims of an arboreal plague. A young giraffe, one of the species most likely to disappear if the woodlands vanish, prospects for food among dead and dying yellow-barked acacias. As recently as the 1960s, this area was heavily wooded. The woodland dwindled by over 90% in 20 years. Concern for the dying forest first led to Amboseli's establishment as a wildlife reserve. Even the baboons, which rely largely on the acacias, showed a drastic fall in numbers, and they're a very resilient species. This baboon is gnawing bark from a surviving tree that has already been badly damaged by elephants. There seemed to be 2 obvious candidates when it came to looking for culprits. The first suspect already had a record of tree murder elsewhere. In Tsavo National Park in Kenya, in Uganda, and at Manyara in Tanzania. In all these places, it was elephants that had barked and killed the trees. The second suspect was another animal. Some wildlife experts believed that the thousands of Maasai cattle, which had overgrazed Amboseli for years, were responsible for vegetational changes that in some mysterious way killed the fever trees. David Weston couldn't accept either of these theories. The facts did not fit the case. He selected cross-sections of woodland containing both damaged and healthy trees. The detailed surveys he and his assistants made revealed some surprising facts. For instance, the worst affected area was in the center of the basin, where there had been no cattle for over 20 years. On the face of it, therefore, the case against the elephant looked proven. 80% of the dead or dying trees showed elephant damage. Yet this didn't account for the fact that the remaining 20% of the trees didn't have an elephant mark on them. Weston next turned his attention to the soil. Here he found the clue which was to exonerate both cattle and elephants. Some wildlife experts had advised shooting the elephants to save the trees, but mercifully no action had been taken. David Weston lands his aircraft among a herd of wildebeest to make one of the tests that was to solve the mystery of the dying fever trees. By analysing the soil in the woodlands, he discovered heavy concentrations of salt close to the surface. Where had it come from? Thousands of years ago, the Amboseli Basin was covered by a large lake. When the lake dried up, the volcanic salts in the water sank into the ground. During periods of heavy rainfall, the salts rise again towards the surface. In the previous 20 years, Amboseli had had unusually heavy rains. Water tests revealed that the reason the trees were dying was that their roots were unable to suck up the salt-impregnated water. Weston proved that the salt was at work in the once magnificent acacia woodlands. This yellow-barked acacia is dying, like so many of its kind, from the top downwards. The highest branches are withering because the roots can't raise the salty water to reach them. Though the condition of the woodlands may look hopeless, Weston believed this was one problem which nature could solve by herself. He reported that the underground water table was sinking, and with it the poisonous salts. Improbable though it may seem, Amboseli's fever trees may just conceivably return of their own accord. But the park has bigger problems, and they are created by man. The presence of the Maasai themselves increasingly threatens the natural appearance of Amboseli. But even though it's now a national park, the land has belonged to the Maasai since long before people began setting aside areas to protect wildlife. When it was made a game reserve in 1947, it was only on condition that the Maasai continued to live and graze their cattle there. Today, their spears no longer terrorize the other tribes of East Africa. They still look down on agricultural tribes. Originally from the Nile Basin, they came down from the north 400 years ago, seizing the land they needed in what is now Kenya and Tanzania. Amboseli and Kilimanjaro lie within Maasai land. There have always been Maasai settlements in Amboseli. It seems strange to find people living, let alone herding cattle, inside a national park. But this is their homeland, not only by government recognition, but by tradition. To them, the national park is an irrelevance. The Maasai are nomads. Cattle, sheep and goats are their livelihood and their wealth. Their lifestyle is simple. The daily round is governed by the need to drive the cattle to water and grazing. The Maasai cling hard to their cattle-keeping traditions, but they're also part of the 20th century. This elder among his goats, wearing a traditional ochre robe, might well be seen a week later in a suit at a district council meeting. During the 9 months of the dry season, The cattle are dependent on the permanent water of the swamps just as the wild animals are. There is no other water for many miles, and the herdsmen must graze their stock within driving distance of the swamps. What this does to the food supply can easily be seen. Only the coarse, unpalatable grasses are left standing. In the dry season, the Maasai see their cows die in hundreds. Something had to be done to relieve the pressure on the grazing. David Weston and his fellow scientists felt that if only water could be piped to the better areas to the northeast, far outside the park, the Maasai might be persuaded to move out of the park altogether. But would the Maasai accept such a proposal? The Maasai are hard bargainers. This is in keeping with their warrior spirit, which is still very much alive. The traditional role of the initiated warrior, or Moran, as both protector and aggressor is unchanged. Today it has little outlet beyond the mock fighting that can break out spontaneously after a feast. The blows exchanged in this fight brought up great weals on the victim's flesh. To the Moran, it was just a good-natured game. Some of the other outlets for this warlike spirit are not so good-natured. Too often, a speared elephant or rhino is not just the result of a Moran proving his manhood, but a sign of the underlying resentment about the park and its intrusion on the tribe's traditional way of life. This rhino had subsequently to be shot. Amboseli cannot afford such losses. The discontent would doubtless come to the surface when bargaining took place about providing alternative water supplies, or proposing that in exchange for this and other concessions, the Maasai should agree to move outside the park. There is one short period of the year, usually between October and December, when all Amboseli's problems are washed away by the coming of the rains. The rains are on their way when the wildebeest give birth in anticipation of a time of plenty. Another sign is there for all to see in the sky. The first storms burst, the high winds whipping up the dust which the rain will shortly lay. Though they've instinctively anticipated this deliverance, the drenched wildebeest stand apparently dejected as the rain teems down. Ironically, Amboseli, now that it has plenty of water, is no longer where they want to be. They know that there is much better grazing outside the park, 15 or 20 miles away to the north. Almost overnight, Amboseli begins to look like the lake it once was. The basin gets most of its annual rainfall in these few weeks. The animals, and not only the wild ones, are off on the long march to the northeast. The Maasai and their cattle make the journey too. For a few weeks, their herds are no longer dependent on the swamps. The rains come only just in time. It's raining in the dry bush country towards which both cattle and wild animals are heading. The rain will soon perform a miracle on the brown land. It may not look exactly lush, but the grasses here have a high food value. It was to this area that authorities planned to pipe permanent water. Within a few days, the thorn bushes suddenly sprout. The brown scrub becomes green. flowers burst out of the barren earth. Zebra, wildebeest and cattle are all on their way north together. This seasonal migration is as much a part of the lives of the Maasai as it is of the animals. After the drought, Amboseli has become green. But its woodlands and savannas are now empty. In the dry season, the animals will all be back. Then the tourists come too, and they're another of Amboseli's problems. Their day starts at dawn, when the minibuses leave their night's roosting places at the two park lodges and set out in search of prey. For the wild animals of Amboseli, the day has no beginning and no end. They have hunted or been hunted throughout the night. In the still peace of the dawn light, they move to find food and water. But the peace never lasts very long. Lions are one of the main quarries of the minibus. Around dawn may be the only time of day when a lioness can teach her cubs to hunt without being disturbed. The wildebeest know that the young cub has no chance of harming them. It's almost like a game, but it's one that will eventually be played in earnest. This lioness has picked out a lone wildebeest for the pride's morning meal. When the lions have finished, the vultures will gather. Until then, an entirely different species moves in. This pride of minibuses has made a spectacular kill. Every day, the insatiable tourists stampede around Amboseli. No one can blame them for this. It's what they've paid to see. Their money keeps the park going. But there's a price to be paid for such excessive use of the environment. The buses often crush the vegetation and give the animals little peace. The number of visitors to the park may increase to 500,000 a year, and the problems they create will have to be solved. One way would be to make the vehicles keep to longer and more circuitous permanent tracks. Another would be to build future lodges outside the park, reducing the traffic in the more popular areas around the present lodges. Continuous game viewing has already had a serious effect on one species. A lone cheetah blinks in the dust of a passing bus. Cheetahs hunting Thompson's gazelle used to be a common sight at Amboseli. Now most of them have been pushed out of the park by the minibuses. The disturbance is so continuous that they rarely get a chance to stalk their own prey, let alone to teach their young to hunt. This may be the last cheetah family that visitors to Amboseli will see, unless some way can be found to leave the animals in peace. The rarest sight of all today is a cheetah actually hunting without a minibus in sight. Apart from the problems caused by dying trees and too many tourists, the national park can only succeed if the Maasai can be persuaded to graze their herds outside Amboseli during the dry season. At last, a solution may have been found. The New York Zoological Society, who financed David Weston's researches for 8 years, have put up $140,000 towards a scheme that has cost, all told, $700,000. With this money, 55 miles of pipeline have been built to fill 6 large water tanks in the area of good grazing outside the park. As this film was being completed, it looked as though the situation at Amboseli had been saved. The Maasai had at last agreed to do a deal, the terms of which were spelt out by the MP for the district. They were offered not only the new water system, but the exclusive use of the southern end of one of the swamps to be declared outside the park boundaries. The MP also promised them compensation for any damage done by wild animals migrating to their new grazing areas in the north during the rains. The Minister for Wildlife and the District Commissioner were all smiles. So were the park staff. But the Maasai Moran waited.
Kwa kupokea fidia hiyo, idara ya mbuga za wanyama inakutaka uondoshe.
The Minister for Natural Resources spelt out what the park would expect in exchange. The Maasai were to move out of Amboseli and take their cattle with them. Further benefits were offered.
Lililowekwa nje ya mipaka ya mbuga hiyo litakuwa ni mali yako na utaweza kulitumia bawa hilo.
The Minister for Wildlife explained that the local Maasai would receive revenue from any new developments at Amboseli, including the planned new lodges to be built on their land outside the park. Finally, they were offered a cheque for 2 million shillings to be divided amongst them. Then the Maasai smiled. The Maasai agreed to honor their side of the contract unless or until future periods of severe drought forced them to return to Amboseli and its swamps. David Weston, who set up a large part of the deal, feels reasonably satisfied. It's certainly the best chance Amboseli has had to date. Amboseli is one of Africa's most lovely jewels. Its setting beneath Kilimanjaro could scarcely be more beautiful. To be able to watch the many facets of this jewel caught in the red rays of the dying sun is one of life's finest experiences. The great mixed herds of game, which are Amboseli's glory, move to find the safest resting places for the coming night. Sunset looks deceptively peaceful to the human eye, but it is the time of the hunter. A lioness tries her luck with a buffalo. The buffalo will see another sun come up on Kilimanjaro. But for how many suns can Amboseli survive in anything like its present form, subjected as it is to so many pressures? David Weston and the other scientists working with him believe it can and will survive. The acacia woodlands at last have the climate in their favor. The water table is sinking again, and acacias can recover very quickly. The Maasai seem to have accepted a workable compromise, and the government has recognized that the tribe should have a financial stake in Amboseli. The tourists will continue to churn around among the dusts of Kilimanjaro, but with good planning, their impact can be reduced. Amboseli sums up man's dilemma the world over: how to enjoy a beautiful, wild place and yet still keep it wild and beautiful. Amboseli may prove that the miracle can be achieved.
The miracle was achieved. Amboseli is once more lush and green, a haven for elephants. The Maasai, settled in the northeast, receive a share of the park's income to use for local amenities at their discretion. Tourist vehicles are restricted to permanent all-weather roads, and the herds and their predators, including the cheetah, live on. From its low point in 1975, Amboseli has recovered its former wild beauty.